If you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who likes to really dig in, get the full story. And that's what we're all about here. Today, we're going deep on a company that honestly has probably touched your life in some way, even if you don't realize it. Medline Industries.
Yeah, it's amazing when you think about how big they are now. I mean, they're truly global, operating in something like 125 countries. We've been looking at everything from their, well, very humble beginnings to how they became such a huge player in healthcare today.
Exactly. And that's really the mission of this deep dive. We want to uncover those moments, the key decisions that made Medline grow the way they did. How do you go from a small workshop right there in Chicago to being such a global force? And we've got a lot to go on here, a bunch of really interesting sources. It's a story with a lot of twists and turns.
Definitely. To really understand where Medline is now, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning,
I know.
back to Chicago and the vision of one man.
And that man was A.L. Mills. Back in 1910, he started the Northwestern Garment Factory. But here's the thing. What he was making wasn't exactly, well, glamorous. He was making aprons, really tough aprons, for the butchers in the stockyards. Not exactly the medical world that we think of with Medline today, right?
Not quite. But what's really interesting is how quickly they changed direction. Just a couple of years later, around 1912, A.L. Mills saw a new opportunity and shifted the whole business towards medical supplies. And that was the start of Mills Hospital Supply. They began producing nurses' uniforms, surgical gowns, those kinds of essential things, mostly for local hospitals. It was very local,
Well,
but they were already building a reputation for quality.
And that whole family element, it was there right from the start. A.L.'s son, Irving, basically grew up in that factory, surrounded by the whole business. He officially joined when he was just 12 years old, and then, get this, he took over the whole operation when he was only 18. Talk about a family legacy, right?
Yeah, that's incredible. And Irving, he had a lot of ambition. He saw that they could do more than just uniforms, so he started distributing a wider range of medical supplies. And he wasn't just focused on Chicago anymore. He began reaching out to hospitals further afield.
There's this story that really shows that early dedication to their customers. It was about how they managed to supply these really remote hospitals out in Colorado during the winter. I mean, picture this. Heavy snow, roads completely blocked, regular deliveries were just impossible.
How do you even get supplies out there?
Well, they figured out this, I don't know, pretty ingenious solution. They'd actually ship everything out before the worst of the snow hit. And then they wouldn't even bill the hospitals until the spring or summer, only for what they'd actually used. That's going above and beyond for your clients, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was a very early version of what we now call consignment shipping. And it did a couple of really important things. It built really strong relationships with those hospitals, and it meant they could serve customers even when, logistics were a nightmare. And by the middle of the century, under Irving's leadership, Mills Hospital Supply had expanded quite a bit. They had offices in Houston, Norfolk, Columbus. They were becoming a major player, at least regionally.
But then in 1961, things changed. Irving decided to sell Mills Hospital Supply. He sold it to a company called Senko Scientific. And at that point, it looked like the Mills family was, well, out of the medical supply business.
It seemed that way, yeah. But that entrepreneurial drive, that desire to build something, it obviously ran deep in the family. Irving's sons, Jim and John, they were A.L.'s grandsons, and they really felt that pull. From what I've read, they felt a bit stifled under the corporate structure at Senko. They wanted to do more.
And that's what led them back to the family business, in a way. In 1966, Jim and John decided to go their own way. They left Senko, and with their father Irving's guidance, they started a brand new company, Medline Industries, in Evanston, Illinois. They started out in a pretty basic warehouse, but they were picking up where their family left off, starting a whole new chapter.
Yeah, exactly. Jim became the chief executive and John was the president. And that very first year, Medline brought in something like $1 million in revenue. Pretty impressive for a brand new company. In the beginning, they were mainly focused on distribution, much like Mills Hospital Supply had been in the early days.
But Jim and John, they had bigger plans. They didn't want to just sell other people's products. They really wanted to be in control of their own manufacturing. So in 1968, they opened their very first manufacturing plant. It was a textile plant in Covington, Indiana. This meant they could now make things like gauze, gowns, bed linens, those essential things.
And they didn't stop with textiles. In 1972, they bought an injection molding company. This became their Dynacore division. And this is a classic example of what people call vertical integration. Basically, it's about owning more parts of your supply chain. By being able to produce their own plastic medical goods, things like basins, bedpans, instrument trays, Medline had a lot more control over quality, costs, and being able to really respond to what hospitals needed.
And it's interesting because 1972 was also the year that Medline went public. They became a publicly traded company. But that didn't last very long. Just 5 years later, in 1977, the Mills family decided to buy back all the publicly held shares. They took Medline private again. That's a pretty big move for a growing company.
It really was. It shows that they were thinking long term. They wanted to be able to make decisions without the pressure of those quarterly earnings reports that public companies have to worry about. So the second time the Mills family had taken back control of their business, first from Schenco and then from the public markets. Shows how committed they were to doing things their own way.
So by the late 1970s, Medline was known for offering good quality medical supplies at prices that were, well, more competitive than a lot of their competitors. Hospitals liked that they were saving money, but it also created this kind of a problem. Some buyers started to think that maybe lower price meant lower quality.
It's that whole you get what you pay for idea.
Exactly. And Jim and John, they knew they had to address that perception. So they did something really, I guess you could say, out there. In 1979, they put together this incredibly glossy, high-end product catalog. It looked more like a fashion magazine than anything you'd expect from a medical supply company.
Yeah, that catalog was legendary.
I know, right? It wasn't just your typical lists of products and specs. They had these really elaborate photo shoots. Doctors and nurses were modeling Medline products in all these crazy scenarios. There was one with a nurse in a tug of war with an orderly using a bed sheet. And there was Betsy Ross sewing surgical drapes. They even had pictures of magicians and belly dancers somehow using Medline stuff. It was wild.
Oh, it was a big gamble. That catalog cost them something like $300,000. That was a huge chunk of their profits that year. But it paid off big time. It might have raised some eyebrows at first, but their textile sales shot up 40% the next year. It really shows that sometimes, doing something totally unexpected can be a brilliant way to change people's minds.
And that catalog, it sent a message. It said that Medline wasn't just about low prices, but also about high quality and innovation. It was like, we're good enough to be in a fashion magazine. And by 1984, Medline was the second largest medical supply distributor in the U.S. They were doing $120 million in sales every year. And to mark that growth, they opened a big new headquarters in Mundelein, Illinois.
And as Medline kept growing, healthcare was changing too. In the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic really changed things, and there was a big new focus on infection control and reducing waste. Hospitals had to rethink their priorities.
Absolutely. Suddenly, disposable products were in huge demand. Gloves, gowns, masks, anything single-use. And because Medline had already invested in manufacturing, they were in a good position to meet that demand.
And one of their key moves was launching their Sterile Procedure Tray Division, or SPT, in 1990. The idea was to create pre-packaged sterile kits with everything you'd need for a specific procedure, surgical or medical. It wasn't just about putting things in a package together. It was about improving sterility, reducing waste in the operating room, saving nurses time. It was a huge efficiency boost for hospitals.
All while they were expanding their product lines, Medline was also expanding geographically. By the early 90s, they had 4 manufacturing plants in the U.S., an assembly facility down in Mexico, and 14 distribution centers. They were really building up their infrastructure. And it makes me think about all the stuff we've read on supply chain management. That early focus on distribution, it was a smart move.
Definitely. And remember that early customer-focused approach, the consignment shipping? Well, that evolved into a more formal program called Access in the early 90s. It was that same pay-as-you-use model, or consignment, where hospitals didn't have to pay for everything up front. It helped them manage their costs and made Medline a really valuable partner.
And that focus on customers kept paying off. In 1993, Medline landed a huge contract. They became a primary supplier for all the U.S. Veterans Affairs hospitals, the VA. That was massive. Not just because of the money, but also because it meant being a key supplier for the biggest healthcare system in the country.
But big government contracts also come with a lot of scrutiny. And in 1996, Medline ran into some trouble. They were accused of violating the Buy American requirements for the VA supplies. Basically, the claim was that they had supplied some products that were made outside the U.S. when they were supposed to be using American-made goods.
That ended up in a settlement in 1997. Medline had to pay $6.4 million, but they didn't actually admit any wrongdoing. It seems like it was a real learning experience for them about the whole world of government regulations and global sourcing.
For sure. It was a complicated situation.
Yeah.
But Medline, they really seemed to take it as a lesson. They focused even more on quality control and making sure they were following all the rules.
By the late 1990s, Medline was the largest privately held medical supply manufacturer in the U.S. And in 1997, Jim and John Mills decided it was time to start handing over the reins to the next generation. Their sons, Charlie and Andy Mills, took over as CEO and president. Jim Abrams was the COO. The family business was continuing.
And this new leadership team, they had grown up with the company, basically. And they took over at a time when hospitals were under a lot of pressure to control costs. Charlie Mills, he really understood that. He saw that hospitals wanted products and services that could help them solve specific problems and make things more efficient.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about the cheapest option anymore. And that was a key insight, for any business. Sometimes solving the customer's problem, even if it costs a little more, is what builds loyalty in the long run.
And that's what led Medline to focus on these value-add products and services. One of their first big moves was buying Kendall Healthcare's exam glove division in 1999. That instantly made them a major player in, a really basic but essential product category. And it fit perfectly with the increasing focus on safety and protection in healthcare.
And they were also looking ahead, thinking about the internet. They partnered with neoforma.com to start selling online. It was their first step into e-commerce, and it showed they were willing to try new things and adapt to the changing world of business.
Around the year 2000, Medline really ramped up their focus on innovation, but it was all driven by feedback from customers. They developed things like advanced wound dressings that use silver ions to fight infection, and they made specialized wet dressings for chronic wounds. They were directly responding to what healthcare professionals were telling them they needed.
They were also investing heavily in infrastructure. In 2000, they built a brand new headquarters in Northfield, Illinois. And they expanded their manufacturing, too, including a big expansion of their textile facility in Alabama. They were pouring money back into the business to meet the growing demand.
And then, of course, came 9/11 and the anthrax scares. That had a huge impact on everything, including healthcare. There was this sudden, massive demand for PPE, personal protective equipment. Medline's phones were ringing off the hook. Hospitals, schools, government agencies, everyone was trying to get masks, gloves, anything they could.
It was a national crisis, and Medline was right in the middle of it. They had to ramp up production, figure out how to manage this incredibly complex supply chain, all while demand was through the roof. It really showed how essential they were to the healthcare system, especially in emergencies. By the end of 2001, their sales had passed $1 billion, and they also got a big new supply contract with Ascension Health. They were really solidifying their position in the market.
Then, in 2007, Medline made another big move. They bought the Curad brand, the bandages. That was their entry into the retail market. They weren't just selling to hospitals and clinics anymore. Curad was a well-known brand, and people trusted it.
Exactly. And Medline used their expertise in wound care from the professional world to give Curad a makeover. They launched all kinds of new products, from specialized bandages to advanced wound care stuff. It was a whole new market for them.
And they also showed they could be really creative and community-minded. In 2009, they launched this campaign called the Pink Glove Dance. It started with a music video, hospital workers dancing in pink exam gloves to raise awareness for breast cancer. It went viral, everywhere.
It was such a smart campaign. It raised a lot of money and awareness for breast cancer, but it also made Medline seem, more human. People saw them as a company that cared about giving back to the community.
And they never stopped innovating. In 2011, they introduced the Curad Biomask, the very first FDA-cleared antiviral face mask. It was designed to actually inactivate viruses on contact. Pretty forward-thinking, right?
Definitely. And then throughout the 2010s, Medline really started expanding internationally. They launched Medline Europe in 2011, headquartered in the Netherlands, and they grew really quickly across Europe.
They were buying up local medical supply companies in different European countries, and they were building big distribution centers, like that huge one in Cleve, Germany. They were serious about becoming a global player.
And it wasn't just Europe. They expanded into Asia and the Pacific, too. They were in over 125 countries with manufacturing facilities in places like Japan and Australia. They were everywhere.
And then, of course, came the COVID pandemic. That was a huge test for everyone, including Medline. The demand for PPE went through the roof globally. And because Medline had that international supply chain, they were a key part of trying to meet that demand.
It was an incredibly difficult time. They were working around the clock to fulfill orders. But the pandemic exposed how fragile the global supply chain really is. There were shortages everywhere. And there were these stories like the one you mentioned about the California doctor who couldn't even accept donated PPE because of an exclusive contract with Medline, even though Medline was struggling to keep up with demand. It was a really messy situation.
It was. And that whole experience, it probably made them double down on their healthcare resilience initiative. They'd launched that back in 2018, and it was all about making their supply chains stronger. They built even more distribution centers, over 50 in North America alone by 2022, including that flagship facility in Grayslake, and they stockpiled even more inventory.
That's where their philosophy of keeping a lot of inventory on hand really paid off. A lot of companies do that just-in-time inventory thing, but Medline always kept a lot in reserve. And when the pandemic hit, they were able to keep supplying hospitals when other companies were running out.
By 2022, they were managing over 300,000 different products, and they were making a lot of those themselves. They were involved in every part of healthcare.
And through it all, they've maintained a really distinct company culture. They call it the Medline way. It's very much rooted in their family ownership. It's all about entrepreneurship, being able to adapt quickly, and that roll-up-your-sleeves attitude. They've been named a top workplace in Chicago for over a decade. That says a lot about what it's like to work there.
Yeah, you always hear stories about how people at Medline have a lot of freedom to make decisions. And because they're a private company, they can move quickly. There's that story about office managers helping to load trucks when they're short-staffed. That roll-up-your-sleeves thing seems to be a real part of their culture.
And that ability to adapt quickly was really important during COVID. They were putting out educational resources for healthcare workers, coming up with new ways to care for patients, like using their patient lifts for proning. And their CEO, Jim Boyle, always talks about how important it is to be customer-focused. That's a core part of who they are.
It's interesting, too, how a lot of their leaders have been with the company for so long. Jim Boyle, the CEO, and Jim Piggott, the president and COO, they both work their way up through the ranks. It seems like a company that values loyalty and promotes from within. And they're also really involved in the community, doing a lot of charity work.
And then there's that huge announcement in June 2021. A group of private equity firms, Blackstone, Carlyle, and Hellman and Friedman, bought a majority stake in Medline. The deal valued Medline at $34 billion. That was a major moment in their history.
Huge, yeah. But the deal was structured so that Medline stayed private and family-led. The Mills family still has a big ownership stake, and the leadership team stayed the same. The idea was to use that investment to grow internationally and build up their infrastructure.
And then, in October 2023, there was a leadership change, but it was all planned out. Charlie and Andy Mills and Jim Abrams, they stepped down from their day-to-day roles and joined the board of directors. Jim Boyle became CEO, and Jim Piggott became president and COO. They'd both been with Medline for a long time, so it was a smooth transition.
Yeah, Charlie Mills said publicly that he had a lot of faith in the new leadership. And Jim Boyle has said he's committed to sticking with Medline's core values. It seems like a well-managed transition.
Looking ahead, Medline has a lot of opportunities, but also some challenges. Healthcare is becoming more and more focused on efficiency, everything's getting digital, and there's this constant pressure to be more resilient. Medline's investing in data analytics, partnering with tech companies like Microsoft. And then there's the aging population. That's going to drive even more demand for medical supplies.
And of course, now that they've got those private equity investors, there's always the possibility of an IPO, going public again. Or maybe they'll get sold to another company. It'll be interesting to see how they balance the Mills family's vision with what the investors want.
For now, though, Medline's huge. They have over 550,000 products, and they're involved in every aspect of healthcare. Their motto is making healthcare run better. And that really sums up their whole story from the very beginning.
It really does. It's a story of adapting, innovating, family leadership, and being committed to healthcare. Over a century of it.
And we learned a lot along the way,
Right.
About how they made those unconventional decisions, like that fashion catalog, and the sheer scale of what they do globally.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about all the things that go into making healthcare work.
Makes you think, yeah. And what's really interesting to me is those core principles. How adaptable they've been, how focused they are on their customers, that long-term vision. You could apply those to so many things, not just business. Like, how do you build resilience, whether it's a global supply chain or your own life? That's something we're thinking about.
Definitely.
That's all for today, folks, but keep those wheels turning. Until next time, stay curious.
Yeah.